So the period of time that we're talking about here is often referred to as either the Neolithic Revolution or the Agricultural Revolution. This term was coined by a famous archaeologist from the early 20th century who was actually the chair of archaeology at my alma mater, long before my time, of course. His name was Gordon Childe. He was a great theoretician. He thought social theorist, talked about lots of concepts of social change, and he's still a very cited and well respected thinker about anthropology and archaeology. But he was also an avowed Marxist politically, but also theoretically. And this isn't a class on cultural anthropology, so we're not going to go too deep into the woods. But he coined the term Neolithic Revolution and a later transition he called the Urban Revolution. He used the word revolution because he was adhering to a particular Marxist view of history. But whether you agree with that, his theory of social change or not, he was onto something, that this was perhaps one of the most profound time periods and changes that has ever happened on our species. As long as human beings have been around, Homo sapiens sapiens, 200,000 years, we existed in a particular way of life. We hunted, we gathered, we followed the trends of nature. But the Neolithic Revolution was our decision and our cleverness of figuring out how we could step in and change the environment to succumb to our own whims. And this set the stage for our many different cultural changes. And at the time that Gordon Childe was coming up with his ideas about the Neolithic Revolution, a trend amongst anthropology was to consider that things were invented just once, that the bicycle was invented one time, the television was invented one time, and from that one invention it spread out. But as it turns out, I use those two examples as a good case in point, because actually the bicycle was invented two times, and by two different people in two different places, and the same thing with the television. Two different people, two different places, similar time period though. And we now realize that agriculture, domestication, and sedentism did not just occur one time in human history. There are at least 8 different occurrences of independent domestication of plants and animals, and they occur all over the world and at different times. So the domestication and sedentism that you find in Mesoamerica, the Mayans, in South America, the Inca, in China, in Papua New Guinea, in Africa, and in the Middle East, those are all different time periods and all different circumstances. Now, as I mentioned before, domestication is humans stepping in for natural selection and making artificial choices to make to genetically modify plants and animals to make them more amenable to what we desire. But you have to have a wild starting point. And so the humans that were making domestication choices about domestication in South America or in Central America had wild species of plants that were indigenous to that area, and they manipulated those to become domesticated species. But the wild species in one place are not necessarily the wild species that you see in other places. So wheat and barley were cultivated and became domesticated plants in the Middle East, but there was no wild precursor to maize or corn there. That came from a wild species of plant that's found in the highlands of Mexico that is called teosinte. And so teosinte was the wild precursor, and humans in Central America, in Mexico, started to make artificial selection choices to result in what we call corn today, or maize. And in China, you have rice. And these are all occurring at different places, at different times, based on indigenous plant and animal species. So every cow that exists today has a wild ancestor, the auroch or Bos primigenius, that was found in Eurasia, and that was domesticated to have qualities that make them smaller, more manageable, more docile, and also have qualities like producing milk and other features, traction animals, and that sort of a thing. So you have the primary products that are that humans domesticated plants and animals for, and then you have secondary products like dairy or skins, or for things like sheep and goats, or alpacas and llamas. You have the fur that they have, the wool, that you can make into clothing as well. A wild species of sheep or goat don't have long fur. Those were characteristics that humans decided they wanted to breed into those animals and then use those as products that were sustainable and repeatable. So domestication and sedentism didn't just occur once in history. It occurred in multiple places at multiple times by different people, and each of those instances had a different starting point, which means they have a different ending point as well. But there aren't an infinite number. So, for instance, domestication and domestication of plants and animals didn't ever begin in Europe. It was imported. There were hunters and gatherers living in Europe, and after it first developed in the Middle East, colonizers into Europe brought that new kind of economic practice with them and influenced or outcompeted the local inhabitants in Europe. The earliest example, however, is something that Gordon Childe was particularly interested in, and that was the area that now occupies the countries of Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Cyprus, Israel, Jordan, Palestine, and Iraq and Iran. This is what's referred to as the Fertile Crescent. Southern Iraq, where the Tigris and the Euphrates go across the flat open plain. In the Neolithic period, no one lived there. It was too dry, too dusty, and nothing really grew. There was not enough rainfall. It was the so-called hilly flanks that fed the waters of the Tigris and the Euphrates River, where the people that lived in this area were able to predict plant species and direct their selection of certain characteristics and stay in one place for long enough that they started to produce domesticated plants and animals and also to settle down and live in permanent villages. And this is the first location in the world where domestication of plants and animals has been proven by archaeology. We have the earliest dates from there. Prior to that, everyone in the world was a hunter or a gatherer, some sort of foraging society. And what you start to see springing up at this time are villages and eventually cities. The first cities are thousands of years after the Neolithic period. But you do have some large population agglomerations that are starting to form from about 10,000 years ago. One of the very well-known and well-studied sites is a village called Çatalhöyük. And Çatalhöyük has been known since the 1960s and well-published and well-excavated. I actually learned about it in my third grade social studies book, believe it or not. It's very interesting in many respects, but rather than, this isn't a course on archaeology exactly, I want to tell you about what the effects of living in sedentary communities are. Now, when you live in a hunter-gatherer community, you are constantly having to move from location to location. Now, you might go back to the same place that you went to the year before, seasonally. That's possible. But you never live in one place permanently. domestication requires you to stay near your crops or to have a system for managing your animals if that's the strategy of survival that you have. For agriculturalists, people that are producing food through crops, you have to live in one place. You can't go wandering around. When you come back, your field will be eaten by animals, or other humans will have come in and harvested it, and the effort that you put in will be for nothing. That's not a good survival strategy. You need to stay put and you need to defend it. Also, having more children means that you, I hate to say it, means you've got more labor. So families increase, and also because you have domesticated plants that are producing more yield, you're able to support a larger population. So these sedentary communities that are staying put start to expand their populations, and in a fairly short period of time, you have pretty big populations of people living together in one place. Now, we all live in cities, we all live in towns and villages, we're all familiar with these things, but these had never been done before. And pre-planning, the unforeseen consequences of this lifestyle change started to affect humans. Where do you go to the toilet, for instance? In a village that has no streets, that you build one house right next to the other, in a sort of honeycomb style, where are you going to the toilet? Well, we can't assume that they were that bothered by sewage. We're bothered by that, but they also didn't understand that unsanitary conditions can cause things like diseases. So a place like Çatalhöyük, which grew very large, very rapidly, and very early, without having the idea of how to plan ahead, where the drainage is, where you put a street. Actually, as it turns out, that to enter into the buildings, it was top entry. They would have had to come in through the roofs and had ladders leading down into their houses. So a lot of activities would have taken place on the roofs of houses. This is an instance where social organization had to catch up to the economic practices that people were starting to change into. That is to say, agriculture and pastoralism. And so this is the earliest instance of domestication and sedentism, but it had it highlights a theme all around the world, that once you start to shift into this new way of life, you have new challenges that are posed that you didn't think about. You have a surplus of food, but you have one type of food. You're not going out there and gathering up a broad spectrum. You have selected, I am going to grow wheat in a field, and I'm going to weed all of these other plants out so my wheat can do well. Now that it means that you are eliminating that broad spectrum. So you're actually reducing the quality of your diet. Also, if you're a farmer, you may or may not have animals. Being a herder is a full-time job. So you might have a relationship with herders, and you might tell them, please don't come eat my field, but you'll have to exchange for those types of other foodstuffs. So if you want meat, it's probably going to be rare for you to have that if you're an agriculturalist, which means that when you were a broad spectrum hunter-gatherer, you were getting meat, you were getting all sorts of different vegetation, and now you are specialized in having this one type of plant product. So there's ill effects that take place. And it's not just the Middle East where it happened first, because these independent inventions of agriculture took place across the world. China and Southwest Asia domesticated rice about 8,000 years ago. In Mexico, corn or maize was domesticated from its precursor teosinte about 9,000 years ago. And it spread throughout the Americas from there. And animal domestication also occurred in different places around the world. The earliest that we know of is wolf into dog about 15 to 20,000 years ago, but cattle, sheep, pigs, and other types of animals, chickens, that sort of thing, eventually, in different places from wild precursors. And we can tell when some of these changes started to take place because we now are dealing with bones, not fossils. And scientific archaeology has been able to analyze physical anthropology has been able to analyze things like stable isotopes in bones. Now, we've already seen in a previous chapter that we all have carbon atoms in our bodies. Carbon-14 is unstable, and we can use that for dating. But actually, there are other types of carbon atoms that are stable. Carbon-12 and carbon-13 are stable isotopes of carbon, and the concentrations of carbon-12 and 13 that you have in your body are dependent on what types of plants that you eat. Some types of plants develop carbon-12, and other types of plants develop carbon-13. And so the ratio that's in your body will actually tell a researcher who is able to analyze those stable isotopes what kinds of plants you ate when you were alive. So for instance, corn or maize does take in carbon-13 during photosynthesis, and other types of plants that were local in the diet prior to domestication took in carbon-12 and not 13. And so you can actually see the shift from a hunting and gathering diet into one of domesticated corn in eastern North America as it was imported by looking at the skeletal remains of humans and their carbon isotope ratios. Also, we need to keep in mind that anthropology for a long time saw cultural evolution as a series of progressive steps that you were improving through time. Get that right out of your mind. Our culture is no better than a hunter-gatherer culture. We have more stuff, we have more complications, but there's a lot of downsides. And for a long time, anthropologists just considered that it was obvious and inevitable that humans would shift from hunting and gathering to doing the better form of survival, which was agriculture, domestication, sedentism. But frankly, there's a lot of downsides, and it's not inevitable, and we know this because there are still hunter-gatherers that exist today, and they're very healthy, and they are actually have some advantages over people that live in the industrialized world. We'll talk a little bit more about industrialization next chapter. But there are a lot of downsides. So for instance, as I mentioned before, having a larger population means that you actually have more labor to produce more food. And having that surplus and domesticated plants and animals means that you can feed that larger population. But larger populations actually have a lot of downsides to them. You see that the birth rate starts to increase. We'll come to the downsides in a moment. But in the Neolithic period, prior to the Neolithic, you had a flat line of the population being just a few million people on the Earth, from 2 to 3 million people in the 100,000 years leading up to the invention of agriculture. But just a few thousand, over the course of a few thousand years, there were 100 times that many people on the Earth. And today there's over 200 times what there were only 2,000 years ago. So the curve started to move up, trend upwards in the Neolithic period, and the curve keeps increasing and increasing and increasing to almost vertical. So the population is expanding, and that puts more pressure on resources to feed all of these people. So it may seem like a good idea at the time to have more offspring. But what does this cause? What does greater populations, especially ones that now have to protect their property and their homes? This isn't just settling down in a campsite. This is your home, and you must defend it, or else you might not survive. So you have things like interpersonal violence. This is very rare to see in hunter-gatherer communities, at least archaeologically, but you see a real uptick in weaponry and evidence for interpersonal violence. So you see injuries, and you see evidence for conflict in villages more than you see in non-permanent settlements. So the advantages of settling down and starting to practice agriculture are that you can support larger numbers of people, and that is something that, at least evolutionarily, that's success, right? And there is a drive for many creatures, including humans, to have more offspring. It also agriculture creates a surplus of food, but you've got to have somewhere to store it. So you have this long-term food storage, especially of things like staple products like grains, but somebody controls that staple food. So you start to have surplus, but can you just go and get that food anytime? The greedy and the gluttonous will just go and take it, so you've got to have some rules. So society starts to adapt itself into a hierarchical structure with somebody who's got the keys to that storeroom, and they will let you know when you can have access to it, or they will redistribute it on your behalf. So people start to become separated from their labor, whereas in hunter-gatherer communities, you are directly getting the food that you need to survive. Whereas when you get into agriculturalism, and especially with division of labor into different types of social roles and jobs, you have the separation of people from their actual survival and their products of their labor. So the disadvantages of moving into agriculture are that, of course, you have increased demands on the environment. So the land itself starts to get degraded. When you have higher yields, you're actually sucking nutrients out of the soil and putting them into plant yields. Now, you can, unless you understand the way it works, and you either leave fields fallow or you have nitrogen fixing plants, you've got to actually understand quite a bit about the way agriculture works, or else you will completely strip the land that you're living on of all of its nutrition. And that's probably not something that a hunter-gatherer would have thought of when they started settling down and producing food. You're also polluting. This is in the villages themselves through sanitation, but also you're polluting things in the landscape